Imagine this. During a family dinner, you bring your boyfriend home to meet everyone for the first time. You expect them to welcome him, but instead all he gets are insults about his job. And it gets worse. At the dinner table, your family demands that you break up with him. What would you do in a situation like that? Let me tell you our story. I'll share why my family treated us that way, how I handled the situation, and the heavy consequences they faced. Hello, everyone. My name is Lisa Harris, and I'm 34. Right now, I live in a small apartment in Greensboro, North Carolina, a southern city big enough to have an energetic pace, but still warm and familiar enough to feel like I belong here. I work as a resident physician at the local hospital. Medicine isn't just a job. It's a passion, a responsibility, and sometimes a burden I willingly carry on my shoulders. My life is simple, with most of my time spent inside the hospital, caught up in endless shifts. And after every exhausting day, the one thing that brings me peace is coming home and sinking into Harlan's arms. My side is his since the days I buried myself in textbooks, the steady support when I nearly broke down during med school. Most importantly, Harlan is the man who showed me that real love doesn't lie in flashy gestures, but in patience and sincerity. But this quiet happiness didn't come easy. I had to go through a painful shock to get here. It wasn't fear of facing critical patients, nor the pressure of working in a hospital. That shock came from the very people I had trusted the most. And after that night, every bit of faith I had in my family came crashing down. The story of my life took a sharp turn 2 years ago during what was supposed to be an ordinary family dinner. That night, I brought Harlan home to meet my family, but I never could have imagined that dinner would become an unforgettable memory etched into my mind and a scar on Harlan's heart. The day before it happened, I called my parents to let them know I'd bring Harlan over for dinner. When she heard the news, my mom, Linda, excitedly lit up. Her voice was full of energy, firing off questions about what Harlan liked to eat and whether he was easy to talk to. I thought maybe, just maybe, Mom was looking forward to meeting the man I love. My dad, Richard, was more composed. He reminded me to manage my schedule carefully so an unexpected shift wouldn't ruin the evening. After that call, I felt the night would be warm and welcoming. But in the end, they were the people who turned that evening into the most bitter memory of my life. Around 6 o'clock the following evening, I brought Harlan into the house where I had grown up. The house held so many memories of a childhood that may have lacked material comfort, but was rich with love, a home that shaped me into the doctor my parents always bragged about to others. That night, Harlan made a strong impression when he walked in. He wore a simple outfit, but his quiet confidence lit up the room. His hair was neatly kept, highlighting the thoughtful lines of his face. His clear skin, gentle smile, and bright, steady eyes made him feel approachable and captivating. Without any flashy jewelry, Harlan still carried a quiet, graceful charm. Also joining us that night was my younger brother, Jacob Harris, 24, fresh into his first year of work. Jacob had brought along his new girlfriend, Vanessa. From the very first meeting, my mom showed a special kind of favoritism toward Vanessa. They complimented her, praising her like she was the perfect woman. And then Vanessa, with words that sounded like playful teasing but were laced with arrogance, helped turn what should have been a warm, intimate dinner into something awkward and calculated. At first, I truly believed my family would recognize Harlan's sincerity and kindness. But through every judgmental glance, every half-hearted smile, and each overly critical comment, I started to see a painful truth. The comparisons within my family had been quietly brewing for a long time, and that dinner was simply the moment it all came out, raw and undeniable. That evening, we all sat around the familiar dining table. My grandfather's presence, George Harris, gave me a bit of comfort. He had always been a steady anchor. Having him there felt like I had an extra layer of protection. But just a few minutes later, that sense of reassurance completely crumbled. When it was Harlan's turn to introduce himself, he calmly shared that he worked at a funeral home. And just like that, the room fell silent. The clinking of silverware stopped, replaced by a hollow stillness that spread through the air. I noticed the subtle glances exchanged, some confused, but most laced with contempt. My heart sank instantly. My mom was the first to break the silence. She tilted her head toward Harlan, her voice slow but sharp as a blade. You're not a doctor? I thought you worked at a hospital. If not, what a shame. Harlan froze for a second at the weight of those words. I caught a flicker of sadness in his eyes, but he composed himself in the blink of an eye and gave a soft smile. His job often made people uneasy, but to me, it was a profession worthy of respect, perhaps even more noble than many of the careers society tends to glorify. But my mom wasn't finished. When Harlan politely handed her a glass of wine, their hands brushed briefly. My mom visibly flinched, then let out a dry laugh and said, almost as if it slipped out by accident, "Your hands are so cold. Must be from touching the dead so much." That sentence nearly made me choke with anger. I looked straight at her and snapped, "Doesn't everyone end up there, Mom?" My words brought a momentary pause to the room. Under the table, I reached for Harlan's hand. It trembled slightly, but his gaze stayed calm, like he was trying to show me he was strong enough to handle it. Then Vanessa laughed out loud. Her laugh was bright, but the words that followed were dripping with scorn. Having someone like that at the table gives me the creeps. In that moment, I caught the faint smirks on my parents' faces. They weren't embarrassed. They were silently agreeing. Their disdain hit me hard, burning like a slap across the face. Before I could say a word, Jacob cut in. He casually stroked his girlfriend's hair while looking at me with amusement. Then, with total confidence, he said I should reconsider who I was dating. And before I had the chance to respond, as if to seal everything shut, my father, Richard, coldly said just one sentence. "Lisa, he's not the right one." The moment those words left his mouth, my chest tightened. Everything they'd said since the start of dinner came crashing down at once, so heavy it took the air out of me. I knew that if I stayed silent any longer, the one who would carry all the pain in that room would be Harlan, the man I once promised to protect. And I couldn't and would never let that happen. Just as Harlan shifted in his seat, as if he was about to get up and walk away from the table to escape the ridicule, my eyes instinctively turned toward the head of the table. My grandfather was still sitting there, silent. But that silence wasn't agreement. Felt like a test. He was waiting for me, the granddaughter he once believed in, to stand up and do the right thing. And I understood right then that if I stayed silent, Harlan would be the one to absorb every ounce of pain in that room. And I could never let that happen. I couldn't hold it in anymore. I stood up abruptly, my voice cutting through the thick air in the room. "What exactly does not the right one mean? Mom, Dad?" The room froze. Right in front of me were my parents. People who looked so calm while tearing down the man I loved. I squeezed Harlan's hand under the table and said loud and clear, each word firm and deliberate, "He's the one I chose, and I won't let anyone interfere with that." My father slammed his hand on the table. His voice exploded like a hammer. "You dare go against your parents?" His roar startled me, but the anger inside me only flared up stronger. Before the tension could settle, Jacob leaned back in his chair, a smug grin forming at the corner of his mouth. "Big sis, you're so blinded by love. Can't you see it?" Right after that jab, as if it were a cue, Vanessa chimed in, throwing out a string of insults I never imagined hearing in my own home. She called Harlan a nobody, mocked his job as fit only for people with no future, and sneered that he didn't deserve to step foot into this family. Hearing her say that I couldn't hold back any longer, I shot up from my seat, voice sharp and low. "Shut up, Vanessa. Say one more word. I swear I won't let it slide." Jacob jumped to his feet too, stepping in front of her, his tone laced with challenge. "What's your problem? She's not wrong, is she?" Out of the corner of my eye, I saw my parents glaring at me as if I was responsible for this chaos. The tension in the room was so thick that it felt like one wrong move and Jacob and I would be at each other's throats. But before that could happen, Harlan slowly stood up. He didn't look at me. He didn't even glance at Jacob. His eyes went straight to Vanessa, calm, unwavering, and direct. His presence cut through the suffocating air like a blade, and what he was about to say made the room grow even more tense. A few seconds after standing up, Harlan turned to Vanessa and asked, "Vanessa, your father, was his name Adam Brooke?" The moment Harlan spoke those words, Vanessa froze. Her face went pale and her eyes flashed with panic, like someone had just ripped open a wound she thought was buried. She stammered, clearly shaken. How do you know that?" That one shaky sentence was all Harlan needed. I saw him faintly smile, then lift his head and look at Vanessa straight in the eye. His voice was calm but cold, bringing up a memory no one at that table could deny. Harlan recounted that a year ago when the hospital called Vanessa again and again because her father's condition had worsened. She never showed up. It wasn't until after he passed away that Vanessa finally arrived, stood there cold and detached as if the man lying in that bed had never given her life. Harlan said there was no way he could forget Vanessa's face. The entire table fell into a heavy silence. No clinking of cutlery. No one dared to breathe. Every eye turned to Vanessa, waiting for her to deny it. But she didn't. She just sat there frozen. The arrogance that had once filled her face had completely drained. Her lips trembled as she tried to fight back. "You're lying!" But her voice wavered, thin, fragile, exposing her far more than it defended her. Her flickering eyes, the nervous twitch in her hands, the fear creeping along the corners of her mouth. It all told the truth she desperately wanted to hide. And while Vanessa still clung to her fake poise, Harlan continued. His voice was steady, so calm it sent a chill through the room. He said if Vanessa truly believed she was being lied to, he'd happily resend the file. The one with the name of the man whose body Harlan had personally placed into a casket that day. A funeral so quiet, not a single family member stayed behind. Each fact he delivered slammed shut the last door Vanessa had been clinging to. In that moment, I sat silently looking around the familiar table and realized something. The silence that filled the room was more painful than any confession could ever be. Felt like a verdict, an invisible judgment that forced everyone there to face a truth that had just been dragged mercilessly into the light. After Harlan's final words, Vanessa's entire facade crumbled. She turned to Jacob with pleading eyes, silently begging him to defend her. But this time, he had nothing to say. He knew better. Jacob understood that Harlan never spoke without proof, and more than anyone, he knew Harlan was telling the truth. Around the table that had once held so many warm family meals, no one even bothered to pretend anymore. My parents sat silently, offering no comfort, support, or defense for Vanessa. The way they looked at her was as if she were a stranger who had just unmasked a side of herself too ugly to ignore. At the head of the table, my grandfather shook his head, disappointment heavy in his eyes. With his calm, firm resolve, Harlan delivered the blow Vanessa could neither dodge nor deny. Realizing she had no way out, Vanessa suddenly stood up. The screech of her chair dragging across the wooden floor cut through the room like a blade. Without saying a word, she stormed out, her face disappearing behind the heavy door. A door that now felt like a wall closing in behind her. Jacob, clearly shaken, bolted from his seat as if to chase after her. Maybe it was fear, maybe desperation, at the thought of losing the woman he'd put on a pedestal. But before he could take a single step, my grandfather's voice rang out, low, steady, and final. "Jacob, sit down." The whole room froze. Then he added, "If you're planning to go after her, then as of tomorrow, don't you dare touch my car again." The weight of that sentence hit everyone like a hammer. I watched Jacob stand there completely still, his eyes vacant, as if something priceless had just slipped through his fingers. The vintage BMW 3 Zero CSL, worth around $350,000, had always been Jacob's pride and joy. He bragged about it to anyone who would listen. Every fleeting relationship he'd ever had somehow involved that car, and I knew deep down that maybe that car was the real reason Vanessa had latched onto him in the first place. A few seconds after Vanessa's figure disappeared behind the door, the room still echoed with the chaos she'd left. Jacob sat frozen, his face blank, stunned by the fact that he couldn't chase after the girl he thought was love, when in truth she'd only ever been attached to the car and the empty status it brought. His hand gripped the table's edge tightly, but no words came out. Right then, my grandfather turned and looked directly at my father. His voice was heavy, each word landing like a knock to the chest. "Why would you treat your daughter like that?" Immediately, my father lifted his head. His voice exploded with fury. "Because she was disrespectful, a daughter who dares to talk back to her father. That's unacceptable." After that outburst, Grandpa just shook his head. He let out a quiet sigh and slowly said, "Have you already forgotten? Back then, you were so ashamed you couldn't even look me in the eye, just because I used to pick through trash, collecting cans and bottles to raise you." Standing at the dinner table, Grandpa recalled when he scavenged for aluminum cans and dug through garbage to feed my father and his siblings. It was a life marked by humiliation and hardship, but he endured it, biting his tongue and carrying on, so his children could have food, clothes, and eventually an education that would let them walk with their heads held high. And now that past, once considered disgraceful, was the very foundation that gave our family everything we had. But Grandpa's story didn't end with scavenging. Over time, he began saving every cent he could, buying and selling secondhand items. Eventually, he opened a small shop to collect and resell scrap. When the market shifted, he adapted, becoming a recycling dealer, signing contracts with local factories. He transformed what was once seen as a lowly job into a real business opportunity. A few years later, he partnered with an export company, shipping processed scrap overseas. Step by step, his business grew. And by the time old age caught up with him, Grandpa had built a fortune, one that much of our family now lives comfortably off of. My father, Richard, enjoys a stable whole life because of the foundation his father laid. Grandpa wasn't just the man who once raised a family on the few dollars he made collecting trash. He was a living example of resilience, what it meant to rise above. In my eyes, he has always been someone worthy of deep respect. His words at that dinner table ripped through the carefully constructed pretense in the room. There was no more space for excuses, for judgment disguised as principle. I looked at my parents, feeling my chest tighten. My voice came out clear, but it trembled slightly with the weight I was holding back. If you want to talk about not being the right fit, then tell me, why is it that I, a doctor, still love you both deeply, even though our family came from so-called humble, unworthy beginnings? And yet, when it comes to Harlan, you choose to look down on him. After I said that, my father's face flushed red. My mother lowered her gaze to the table. But instead of admitting any fault, their shame twisted into anger, and finally, my father shouted, "Get out of my house, both of you." At that moment, I felt something sink deep into my chest. Just as I reached for Harlan's hand, ready to leave my parents' house, my grandfather's voice cut through the air unexpectedly. He leaned on his cane and motioned for both of us to sit back down, his tone sharp and commanding. "No one's leaving. Sit down." And the moment he spoke, I knew this wasn't the end. It was the beginning. At the dinner table, with the main course still untouched, steam still rising from the plates, my grandfather turned to look my father dead in the eyes and said firmly, "If anyone's leaving this house tonight, it's you and your wife, because I'm still the legal owner of this home." My father immediately snapped back, his voice tense. "Dad, the house is already in my name." But Grandpa just gave a slight smile, not wide, but enough to make my father flinch just for a moment. Then he answered calm and unshaken. "Yes, the house is in your name, but have you forgotten? The clause I added when we signed still holds full legal weight." Those words left my parents speechless. They knew exactly what he was referring to. The clause in the transfer documents. If the heir ever showed favoritism, acted unfairly toward any family member, or tried to force their children out of the house, the entire agreement would be void. Ownership would immediately revert to my grandfather. If he passes away, the whole property will be donated to a charitable foundation for orphan children. When Grandpa brought that up, I saw panic across my parents' faces. They realized in that very moment that titles and control no longer gave them the power to dominate me. My grandfather's voice filled the room, slow, steady, but with the weight of final judgment. It hung in the air like a verdict, forcing them to face a truth they'd spent years trying to ignore. After that night, after my grandfather's words rang out like a final judgment, I quietly took Harlan back to our small apartment. On the drive home, I didn't say much. I held his hand tightly, as if that gesture alone could say what I couldn't. "I'm sorry." Once we got home, I whispered an apology for letting him go through so much pain. But Harlan just shook his head gently. He told me he knew I had done everything possible, caught between family and love. Hearing that, my chest tightened, aching but oddly relieved. I thought that night would be the end of it, that after the chaos at the dinner table, we could finally close the door on it all. But the next morning, just as I was getting ready to leave for my hospital shift, I opened the door, and there was Jacob standing on the threshold. His face was flushed with dark circles under his eyes. He launched accusations before I could even get a word out, blaming me for everything. He shouted that I was the reason Grandpa had returned the keys to the vintage BMW, the one thing he'd always flaunted as his most significant source of pride. It wasn't until much later that I learned what had happened after we left that night. Jacob had broken down before our parents, sobbing after Vanessa texted him to end things. Grandpa had been there watching in silence. He didn't say a word. He returned the keys to the car Jacob had long treated like a trophy. To Jacob, I was the cause of it all. So he came to my door to unload it on me. And there he stood, a 24-year-old man who had just lost his girlfriend, lost his car, standing there like a kid who'd had his favorite toy taken away. But for me, all I felt was exhaustion. I was done. I'd spent too long tolerating a grown man who did nothing but cling to others, cry, and blame. I ignored his slurred complaints, brushed past him, and headed to the parking garage. He followed behind, ranting angrily, but I didn't look back. I left him standing there, helpless, like a shadow. No one noticed. What I didn't know then was that my indifference would become the beginning of the next tragedy. Late that night, just as my shift was winding down, the ER called in a critical case. When the nurses rolled in the gurney, I froze. Lying motionless in front of me was Jacob, my brother. The moment I saw him, my chest tightened. I rushed forward, forcing myself to stay focused, to check his pulse, to administer emergency care. Every movement of mine trembled, caught between the duty of a doctor and the panic of an older sister, barely holding it together. A few minutes later, my mother arrived at the hospital. Her face was gaunt, her eyes swollen and red from crying. She told me earlier that evening, Jacob had taken the spare keys to the BMW and driven off to find Vanessa. But when he showed up, she humiliated him. Threw everything from the dinner back in his face, called him a coward, and didn't hold back. After their argument, Jacob called my mom. His voice was shaky, nearly unrecognizable from panic. Then the line went dead. For hours after that, no one knew where he'd gone until the police called. They had found the car on the side of the highway, its front end smashed into a concrete divider. Jacob was slumped over in the driver's seat, reeking of alcohol. As I listened to my mother's voice, everything around me seemed to blur. A cold sweat traced down my spine. And in that moment, I realized sometimes just walking away, just turning your back, it can be the final drop that breaks the dam. The one that pushes everything past the point of no return. Inside the emergency room, I gave everything I had to keep my younger brother alive. This brother who had lost himself chasing a love that was never truly his. My heart pounded, and my white coat still carried the sharp antiseptic sting. My mind was spinning with questions I couldn't shake. What was it about Vanessa that drove Jacob to destroy himself? But before I could begin to process that, something else happened. Something that left me completely numb. The door to the ER cracked open, and my father came charging in. His face was flushed red, his eyes burning with fury, as if he wanted to set me on fire right then and there without a second thought. He roared, his voice echoing down the corridor. "This is your fault, Lisa." I stood frozen. His son was lying on the edge of life inside that room, and yet his first instinct wasn't worry or fear. It was to find someone to blame. Before I could respond, he jabbed a finger at my face, his voice grinding through his teeth. If you hadn't pushed him, if you hadn't taken away what he loved, he wouldn't be like this. A chill ran straight down my spine. He accused me of taking what Jacob loved. But I had to ask myself, was he talking about the BMW, a car that was never Jacob's, only lent to him by Grandpa, or was he talking about Vanessa, the woman who had just humiliated Jacob and walked away without a second glance? Neither of those things ever truly belonged to Jacob. Yet somehow, in my father's warped view, it had all become my fault. I tried to stay calm, swallowing the tight knot in my throat. I told him quietly that I had done everything I could in the ER, and if we were being honest, Jacob had made the choices that led him here. But my words fell flat. They evaporated into the space between us. Nothing I said could reach him. In his eyes, everything still pointed back to me. My mother stood to the side, her shoulders trembling as she cried silently. But she didn't say a word. In her tear-filled eyes, I could see it. Exhaustion, helplessness, torn between Jacob's pain and my father's venom. She'd lost all sense of what was right or wrong, and me, I stood there stuck in that hallway. On one side, I was the doctor who had just fought to keep my brother breathing. On the other hand, I was the daughter being blamed for everything, tried and convicted in my father's eyes. But the part that hurt the most wasn't what he said. It was how he looked at me with a coldness, a distance, like I wasn't even his daughter, like I never had been. That night, after I led my parents out into the hallway, my grandfather had just arrived. I tried to reassure them that the emergency was under control, but right then, a nurse burst out of the trauma room, face pale, voice trembling, as she said Jacob was crashing again. I had no choice. I rushed back in, my heart pounding, and dove straight into saving my brother's life. Inside, I poured every ounce of knowledge, every skill I'd learned over the years dealing with critical trauma cases. But this time, it was different. This wasn't a stranger lying on the table. It was Jacob, the brother I'd grown up with under the same roof, the boy who shared my childhood. Our laughter, our hunger, our scraped knees and secret jokes. I couldn't let myself fail. Not today. Not with him. Outside, my family waited, holding on to whatever hope they could. But little by little, that hope began to fade. Jacob didn't make it despite every emergency measure and everything we tried. The impact had been too severe. Multiple chest injuries, massive internal bleeding. After nearly 40 minutes of fighting, his heart gave out. I watched the flat line crawl across the monitor. My hands trembled as I let the endotracheal tube slip from my fingers. And in that moment, as Jacob's heart stopped, it felt like part of mine stopped, too. My arms shook and it hit me like a wave. I had just lost a piece of my childhood, a piece of my family. On the other side of the door, they were still waiting, and I had never imagined that I'd be the one to do what came next. After standing silently for a few minutes, staring at my little brother's still body, I walked out, my white coat damp with sweat and streaked with blood. My voice was raw, barely above a whisper. We did everything we could, but Jacob didn't make it. My mother collapsed in sobs, screaming as she fell into the arms of a nurse. My grandfather stumbled, barely able to stay upright with his cane, his eyes clouded in unspeakable grief. But my father, he didn't cry. He didn't flinch. He turned slowly toward me. His eyes were bloodshot, wild with rage. And then he shouted so loud it echoed down the hallway. "This is your fault. You killed your brother." His words crushed something inside me. My knees buckled slightly, my chest seized up, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. I had just lost my brother, and in that same breath I lost what little faith I had left in my father. Before I could even speak, my grandfather slammed the end of his cane on the tile floor and struck my father lightly across the leg. His voice cracked with grief, but stayed firm. "Enough! Haven't you done enough already?" As the sound of his cane faded into the cold hospital hallway, I stood there frozen. My father's accusations echoed in my mind over and over like an invisible sentence. I couldn't escape. I had lost my brother. And instead of comfort, I'd been marked as the one to blame. That pain cut deeper than any ER wound I'd ever seen. And in the silence that followed, I found myself asking, had I failed? Should I have stayed with Jacob that morning in the parking lot? Or was I just the scapegoat for everyone's guilt, for everything no one could control? The weight of those questions pressed on my chest like a stone. Then I saw Grandpa's eyes. He looked at me, his gaze filled with sorrow and understanding. Slowly, he placed a hand on my shoulder. His grip, aged and worn, was steady and strong. "You did everything you could, Lisa." I bit my lip hard, but it was no use. The tears came anyway, not just for Jacob, but because in that moment, I realized I hadn't just lost my brother that night. I had lost my family. That night, after we couldn't save Jacob, I ended my shift carrying a pain that felt like it was tearing through my chest. It was without a doubt the most haunting shift of my life. After I, acting as the attending physician, officially declared the time of death and completed the paperwork, Jacob's body was moved to the hospital morgue about an hour later, waiting to be released to the funeral home as protocol required. I thought I'd finally have a moment to breathe, to find even a sliver of quiet, but fate had one more cruel twist in store. When the funeral home staff arrived to receive Jacob, standing among them was Harlan. I told him what had happened in a short, hurried phone call. His voice cracked with shock, but he had no choice. Harlan was bound to carry out his duty as someone in this profession, even when he knew exactly what and who waited on the other side. At the funeral home, Harlan was the one who personally prepared Jacob. He washed his body, dressed him in fresh clothes, and gently smoothed the messy hair that hadn't survived the crash. Every motion he made was quiet, respectful, and heartbreakingly tender. It wasn't just his job, it was his final goodbye. By the time Jacob was placed into the open casket, he looked like he was sleeping. a peaceful rest at just 24 years old. When my mother saw him, she nearly collapsed. My father stood still, his face hardened like stone. I stepped closer, but no words came. In that short moment, I did the only thing I could. I held Jacob's cold hand just for a second, then stepped aside to make space for my mother. She took his hands in hers, sobbing silently, while I stood behind her, silent, helpless. Maybe that was the last thing we could do for Jacob. And from that moment on, the boy I grew up with, the brother I loved, would forever remain frozen at the most beautiful age of his life. Jacob's funeral took place under a cloud of sorrow. Harlan had prepared everything with quiet dedication, from the arrangements to the final rites. I knew every small detail he handled came from a place of deep respect for Jacob, and that alone made my parents slowly begin to reflect on how they had once treated him. On the day we said goodbye and laid Jacob to rest with God, Grandpa gently placed his hand on the casket and whispered a final farewell. My parents stood nearby, eyes swollen and red. After days of pain, the way Dad looked at me no longer carried the same heavy weight, and just as I turned to walk away, his voice cracked behind me. "I'm sorry, Lisa. I'm sorry to you and Jacob for not being wise enough to keep this family together." That apology hit me like a rush of air after being underwater. My chest felt 100 times lighter. I knew things might never return to how they were. But at least the blindness that once clouded my parents' judgment had finally lifted. But Jacob's passing wasn't the end. After the funeral, the entire family sat down together. We talked honestly. We hugged, trying to soothe the pain in the only way we knew. I thought Vanessa was gone for good, vanished the same quiet way she disappeared after Jacob's death. But I was wrong. Almost 7 months after Jacob passed, life moved on. I returned to my job at the hospital, Harlan continued his work at the funeral home, and my parents took care of Grandpa. I thought time would gently put everything to rest just as Jacob had left us peacefully in the stillness of night. But the past wasn't finished with us. That day was Thanksgiving. I brought Harlan home after we had finally picked a wedding date. The house was filled with warmth and a genuine sense of acceptance. My parents didn't say a single word to belittle his work anymore, and Grandpa smiled with quiet contentment at seeing us happy. But just as dinner began, the sharp cry of a baby rang out from the front door, and in an instant, everything stopped. I got up to open the door as the crying grew louder. No one was there, just a basket placed neatly on the doorstep. Inside was a baby wrapped in a thick blanket. Next to it was a bag of clothes and a folder of medical documents. The whole family rushed to the door, frozen in shock at what we saw. I quickly opened the folder. Inside were prenatal checkups, ultrasound images, and a DNA test taken during Vanessa's pregnancy. The result was undeniable. Jacob was the father of the baby. At that moment, the truth hit like a blade. Vanessa was the one who had given birth to this child. When I checked the footage from the gate camera, the image was crystal clear. Vanessa had carried the baby to our doorstep, set it down, and walked away without looking back. There was no other choice. I called the police immediately. They arrived, documented everything, sealed the folder, and officially filed a report for abandonment of a child, a serious offense. The baby was temporarily placed in the custody of Child Protective Services while further decisions were made. After the officers left, taking the child into protective custody, the house fell into a silence too heavy for words. My mom collapsed onto the couch, sobbing into her hands. Dad stood frozen, eyes locked on the space before him. Grandpa let out a long, quiet sigh and said softly, "No matter what, that child is still our blood." Those words cut straight into my heart. The baby hadn't chosen to be born into this mess, and it certainly didn't deserve to be abandoned on the doorstep of the father it would never meet. That night, neither of us could sleep. I lay still, pretending to be asleep, when I heard Harlan's soft voice break the silence in the dark. "What if we adopt the baby, Lisa?" I opened my eyes instantly and turned to look at him. He didn't need to say anything more. I knew right then this was a decision we both shared. In the following days, we began a new journey. Home interviews, background checks, and endless questions from social workers. All of it to prove we were fit to become this child's parents. Every time we waited for the next step, I thought of my brother's eyes. I thought of how suddenly his life had ended, and I knew I wouldn't let a piece of Jacob's blood be abandoned ever again. And then after what felt like forever, the answer finally came. The day we were officially granted custody was a cold morning. At the county courthouse, the judge read the decision in a steady, warm voice, declaring that from that day forward, the child was ours. My heart pounded, my hands trembled. I leaned down and lifted the tiny sleeping body wrapped in a soft blanket. His warmth flowed into me, calming every ache left behind by Jacob's absence. Next to me, Harlan couldn't hold back his tears. He whispered, his voice shaking with emotion, "Welcome home, Ethan. You're part of this family now, Ethan." That name wasn't chosen by accident. In the Bible, Ethan means strong, enduring. We believed that even if his beginning was lost, his future would be filled with love and hope. When we brought Ethan home, Grandpa was already waiting at the door, his eyes sparkling with joy and pride. He gently placed his frail hand on my shoulder, his voice quivering. "Jacob is gone, but this boy will carry on. Thank you, both of you." My parents stood just behind him, silent. I met my father's gaze, not filled with blame like before, but something else, regret and maybe even relief. He slowly nodded at me for the first time in years, a quiet acknowledgement, late but real. In that moment, I understood that while nothing could ever make up for losing Jacob, Ethan's presence was the gift that would begin to mend the cracks in our family. After bringing Ethan home, our lives turned an entirely new page. I, a doctor long used to endless shifts and the simple hope of rest after each emergency, now found myself racing to finish work just to get back home and see my little boy sleeping peacefully in his crib. Harlan was different too. From the moment we adopted Ethan, he decided to leave his job at the funeral home for good. To him, those early years of Ethan's life were too precious, more important than any career. The gentle look in his eyes as he held Ethan in his arms told me everything. We had truly become a family. But the change didn't stop with us. It reached my parents too. Before retiring, they spent most of their time at a senior club, finding joy in card games and old friends. My grandfather had retreated to the backyard garden, quietly tending flowers to fill the space left behind by the life he could no longer chase. But once Ethan arrived, everything shifted. The gatherings outside the house grew fewer, replaced by quiet afternoons spent around the crib, watching the baby wave his arms, kick his feet, their faces lit with a happiness I had never seen in them before. And every time I watched that scene unfold, I would find myself glancing at the photo of Jacob in the center of our living room. In the picture, he was still smiling, his eyes full of life. I would silently pray that somewhere out there he could find peace, knowing his son was growing up surrounded by people who truly loved and protected him. And maybe, just maybe, it was Ethan's presence that helped us finally understand. Even when tragedy tears a family apart, love will always find a way to piece it back together. And today, exactly 2 years since that fateful dinner that tore everything apart, my family is no longer the same. But we've learned to love differently from that moment on. Harlan has left his old job behind. He says his life is complete now, with 2 little angels to care for, one babbling his first words, and the other gently stirring in my womb. When he said that, I smiled. A quiet, overwhelming gratitude welled inside me because he chose to stay through all the loss and storms. He decided to build this peaceful home with me. My parents have changed too. With another grandchild on the way, the harshness they once carried is long gone. Every week, they show up at our tiny apartment to care for their son-in-law and hold the child they now love dearly. As for Grandpa, since the day Jacob passed, he had his old car restored and then sold it at an auction. He quietly donated every cent to a fund for abandoned children. He said, "Maybe that's the best way to turn our family's loss into a small ray of light for those who've had even less." And Vanessa, since the night she left the baby behind, she hasn't returned. Her disappearance was bitter and painful, but eventually we all came to understand. Some people don't bring peace. They only leave wounds behind. And me, in the middle of long overnight shifts at the hospital, every time I come home and see Ethan sleeping peacefully in his crib, see Harlan smiling softly in the warm glow of the lamp, I finally understand. No matter how deep the loss, love still finds a way to fill the empty spaces. If there's one thing I hope to leave you with after all this, it's this. Families are never perfect, but as long as there's love and grace, we can rise again from the ruins and never look down on anyone's job or life choice. because sometimes it's the very thing that becomes a source of pride, the one thing holding an entire family together. This is where my story comes to an end. 2 years have passed, and many people have learned what happened to my family. Some have shown sympathy. They've told me I did the right thing, that Jacob's tragedy wasn't my fault, that it was simply his fate. But others have spoken out against me and Harlan. They say we were the ones who brought tragedy into my brother's life. Some blame my parents, saying they were the reason Jacob became weak and that he paid for it with his life. And then some say Vanessa was the cause of it all. So, what about you? What do you think led to the tragedy of Jacob's life? What do you believe was the real reason behind it? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Please share them in the comments below. If this story resonates with you, please support us by subscribing to the channel, giving it a like, and sharing it with others. Thank you for staying with me through this long journey. I'll see you again in the following story.